You're watching a BBC News special results programme on the US midterm elections after a night in which President Trump has suffered a significant setback and some gains. Both sides claim victory of sorts. The Democrats have taken control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 8 years. But Republicans strengthen their grip on the Senate, with a number of Democrats losing their seats. President Trump calls the results a tremendous success. But what does the new balance of power mean for his agenda?
Today is more than about Democrats and Republicans. It's about restoring the Constitution's checks and balances to the Trump administration.
An election of firsts. Congress will represent a wider range of Americans, with more women and minority lawmakers than ever before. And an exceptionally high turnout has been recorded, with voting extended in some states. Hello and welcome to our special results programme on the US midterm elections. I'm Annita McVeigh. In the first big test of Donald Trump's presidency, the Democratic Party has taken control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 8 years. You can see the figures at the top of the graphic there. The Democrats with 219 seats, that's up 27. Republicans down 27 seats, 194, with some results still to be declared, though, of course. President Trump's Republican Party has consolidated, meanwhile, its hold on the Senate. The lower set of figures, the Democrats down 2 seats, the Republicans up 2 seats. Still some seats to declare there as well. So let's have a closer look at the results. Well, all 435 seats in the House of Representatives, that's the lower chamber of Congress, were contested. As I mentioned, some results are still being counted, but this is the current makeup of the chamber. Blue for the Democrats, red for the Republicans, the figures that I just mentioned in a little bit more detail. And here the Democrats have gained, as you can see, more than the 23 seats that they were needing to grab to take control. But in the Senate, the upper house of Congress, where just over a third of seats were up for election, the Democrats have lost ground and the Republicans have increased their majority. So this is the current makeup of the Senate. 45 blue for the Democrats, 51 red for the Republicans, with some results still to come in. Well, President Trump has been quick to celebrate his party's gains, calling the night a tremendous success. Our Washington correspondent Chris Buckler looks back at the night's key moments and what it means for American politics.
This was an evening when Democrats finally had a reason to celebrate. With female candidates at the forefront of their success, they won a majority in the House of Representatives. A victory that will place limits on Donald Trump's presidential power.
Today is more than about Democrats and Republicans. It's about restoring the Constitution's checks and balances to the Trump administration.
But Republicans held their ground in the Senate.
God bless Texas!
Ted Cruz among those to hang on to a seat in Texas despite a fierce challenge. And Marsha Blackburn won in Tennessee after a bitter campaign that cost tens of millions of dollars.
Democrats take House.
It gave an opportunity for both sides to claim victory.
This is it. The Democrats have taken control of half of one of the 3 branches of government. All the GOP has is the other half of Congress, the Supreme Court, and a president who does whatever he wants. So far, tonight's feeling is, yes. All yes.
For America, it was a midterm election unlike any other. A vote that was seen as a referendum on Donald Trump's presidency, and one that led to an exceptionally high turnout. The president flew into state after state, holding 30 rallies in the last 2 months alone, and putting himself at the centre of tight Senate races.
Thank you very much, Missouri. It is great to be in Indiana.
Hello, Houston.
Wow, look at that crowd.
Oh, do we love Nashville.
Get out in 2018 because you're voting for me.
That personal involvement seems to have made a difference.
candidates that have embraced the president, embraced his policies, and that he's gone in and campaigned for and worked hard for. We're seeing that pay off tonight.
On Twitter, Donald Trump called the results a tremendous success. And there will be relief inside the White House that Republicans have held on to the Senate. But Democrats taking the House of Representatives will cause problems for the president. They'll be able to block legislation and frustrate some of his more contentious plans. Congress, just like America, is now divided. Political power split between the two chambers, and the parties every bit as far apart. Chris Buckler, BBC News, Washington.
And let's go to Washington now and get some more from Chris. Chris, a long day and a long night for you. So not quite the blue wave, perhaps, but a steady flow for the Democrats and certainly significant gains in the House. How significant is this now in terms of the balance of power in American politics?
I think it's very significant in that the Democrats have managed to get the House of Representatives. It does make a real difference to President Trump because up to this point, he's had Republicans in both parts of Congress essentially being able to push through the policies that he wants. Yes, there have been times when he's been frustrated because there have been Republicans who have decided that they don't want to back him. Famously, of course, including the late John McCain. And at times there have been other senators as well who have felt uncomfortable. But generally, he's had it his own way. All of that changes now because the Democrats all of a sudden have this power, not just to block legislation, as mentioned, but specifically, they can also start to launch inquiries, start to investigate things, potentially look into, for example, Donald Trump's tax affairs, whether there's potentially conflicts of interest, all things which are going to irritate Donald Trump. There's no doubt that up to this point, he has felt very strongly that his way is the right way. If he wants to get things done, the suggestion is he'll have to work with Democrats. And given those deep divides that exist in American politics right now, I don't think that's going to be easy.
It's certainly going to make for a very interesting couple of years ahead, up to 2020, the next presidential election. The Democrats making gains, but the Republicans also making gains in the Senate, doing very well, particularly in areas where Donald Trump went and campaigned personally. So do you think he feels he's got a good platform to go for the presidency again in a couple of years?
You know, he's already tweeted that this is a success. He's already tweeted people who have said that he did very well in this campaigning. And there is no doubt that he has been extremely energetic and extremely focused. He's a man who likes campaigning, but his rallies do seem to have made a difference in those states which he specifically targeted. He knew where there were tight races, where the Senate could be in jeopardy. And he went out to make a difference. And if you look at the votes, if you look at the figures, he does seem to have made a difference. And you mentioned 2020. He's already talking about that. He's already got his slogan of Keep America Great. And even during those rallies, he was laying the groundwork for it. So it might seem very early to start talking about a presidential election in 2 years' time. But the truth is Donald Trump is doing it. And he is already laying that groundwork. And he can say that he's had success this time by being out there and motivating his base. And the problem for the Democrats is they really need to find someone who can attack that, who can do the same thing on their side. So far, they're a party that has an old voice in Barack Obama who came forward. You could argue that Joe Biden also made something of a difference in terms of rallies. But they haven't got the new leadership that's going to take them to 2020. And that's something they're going to have to address pretty quickly because President Trump is already thinking about that election.
OK, Chris, thank you very much. Chris Buckler in Washington. Well, many Democratic hopes had been pinned on Florida, which is a key swing state. Now, the Democrats did make gains in the House. An awful lot of seats there, too many to go through in individual detail, but they did win 2 seats in the House in the southern tip of the state. But the figures you're looking at now are for the Senate, where they were just pipped at the post, as you can see, quite narrowly by the Republicans in Florida in the Senate race. And there was also a big contest, a contest of big personalities for the governor's position in Florida. You had Andrew Gillum for the Democrats, who was looking to become the first African-American governor of Florida, versus Ron DeSantis for the Republicans. But Ron DeSantis, the Republican candidate, did win. Andrew Gillum conceded in what was a very interesting race, a very publicised race in the American media. And we'll hear from Andrew Gillum in just a moment. But first, let's get this report from our correspondent, Rajini Vaidyanathan, who's in Florida.
Well, it wasn't a good night for the Democrats here in the crucial state of Florida. For a start, they lost control of the one Senate seat that they held. It had been held by Bill Nelson for 3 consecutive terms, but tonight Republican Rick Scott, the former governor of this state, won that seat, helping boost Republicans' fortunes in the Senate as they hang on to control of the Senate. Also, the Republicans held on to the governor seat here. Now, the Democrats were hoping that their candidate, Andrew Gillum, would become the first black governor for the state of Florida. But in both of those races, it wasn't necessarily a ringing endorsement for the Republican Party, because both of the races were won by the Republicans by a very, very close margin of just under 1%, which just gives you an idea of how close Florida is. It always is in national elections too. Now, there were some good moments for the Democratic Party. They picked up 2 congressional seats in somewhat surprise, some would say. That's also helped them pick up control of the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. In many ways, though, Florida reflects a changing America. And what we've seen here in these very tight races is just how polarized this state and America indeed is.
Rajini Vaidyanathan. Well, this is the moment the Democrat candidate for the governorship, Andrew Gillum, who was hoping to be the first ever African-American governor of Florida, told supporters he'd conceded to his Republican rival.
I want you to know that in spite of our congratulating him on his victory this evening, nothing that we believe in is compromised. I still believe that we ought to pay teachers what they're worth. I still believe that. I still believe that we ought to clean up our environment, our air, our water quality, our beaches, our shores. I still believe that we ought to have the kind of economy where people are able to work 1 job instead of 2 and 3 jobs in order to make ends meet. I'm extremely proud that this evening the voters of the state of Florida decided to pass Amendment 4. Proud about that. That is just 1 step closer to getting us where it is that we need to be as a state. Y'all, I want to encourage you not to give up. I want to encourage you to stick to the fight. I want you to know that every step of this way, even though I won't have the blessing of serving as the next governor of the state of Florida, I still plan to be on the front lines right alongside every single one of you when it comes to standing up for what it is that we believe in.
Andrew Gillum. So how did the Democrats win the House for the first time in 8 years? Well, it was by taking suburban districts where Hillary Clinton won in 2016. One of those was the 7th Congressional District in New Jersey, where Democrat Tom Malinowski unseated Republican Leonard Lance. You can see the final result on your screens right now. A win for the Democrat blue. Nada Tawfik was there.
Well, New Jersey really reflected what we've seen play out on a national scale, where Democrats really won in suburbs, in urban areas. And in New Jersey in particular, it really was a dissatisfaction with President Trump that drew Democrats and also moderate Republicans to really vote Democrat. So, for example, in one district, New Jersey's 7th district, Leonard Lance was in one of the districts that went for Hillary Clinton. He was a moderate Republican who tried to campaign and say he was bipartisan, but that wasn't enough for voters in that district who felt that he didn't do enough to really rein in President Trump. And so he lost there. And Democrats picked up 3 seats from Republicans here alone. One of the contests is still a very competitive race, but it really just reflects, again, as I say, this dissatisfaction with President Trump. And we also saw in New Jersey the fact, as you were talking about earlier, that women, political newcomers, a new wave of people being politically engaged, were present here in New Jersey as well.
Nada Tawfik, well, the House Minority Leader, at least until now, Nancy Pelosi, had been confident about Democrats taking the House from the Republicans. And earlier, she spoke to supporters in Washington.
Democrats will clean up corruption to make Washington work for the American people. Republicans will only continue the toxic GOP culture of cronyism, incompetence, and corruption that grows more brazen and more destructive every day. We have seen Washington Republicans work relentlessly to distract, divide, and cover up anything to shift the focus from the GOP's tax scam for the rich and their cruel campaign to take away America's health care. But we don't agonize, we organize.
Nancy Pelosi. Well, let's cross now to Capitol Hill, where we can speak to Nicole Killian, CBS News correspondent. Hello to you, Nicole. Well, definitely a shift in the balance of power, but arguably we're seeing American politics even more polarized as a result of these midterms.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can expect things to become even more divided and polarized over these next few years, especially now that we have this split decision with Democrats taking the House and the Senate. Actually, Republicans will retain control there, but have obviously built up their majority. And so, even when Republicans were in control, we certainly saw a lot of partisan rhetoric on both sides, but that is certainly likely to grow, as I mentioned, over the next 2 years. Now, Democrats have already suggested that they could, for instance, try to probe into the president to launch investigations. They now have subpoena power in the House. Unclear exactly how far they will take things. The White House already pushing back against that, with one of the president's aides, Counselor Kellyanne Conway, saying, why would they want to bother with that and go that route? But certainly that could pose some challenges to the president. We do know last night, according to the White House, that he did call a Democratic leader, Nancy Pelosi, who is likely to be in line to become the next House Speaker, a position she has held before. According to her office, he did express his congratulations and kind of acknowledged her nod to bipartisanship. But again, it will be interesting to see if, in fact, that actually happens. Anita?
Nicole, thank you very much. Nicole Killian from CBS News. Well, let's take a closer look now at last night's results and what they could mean for the Trump administration. With me here in the studio is Dr. James D. Boys, Professor of International Political Studies at Richmond, the American University in London. I'm also joined by Dr. Clodagh Harrington, Senior Lecturer in Politics at De Montfort University in Leicester. A very good morning to both of you. An awful lot to talk about. James, let's begin with you. So not quite a blue wave, would you agree, but significant gains for the Democrats nonetheless?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. The Democrats had talked up the idea of having this blue wave, not dissimilar to the blue firewall that they described that was going to elect Hillary Clinton 2 years ago. The Democrats certainly had a good night, but it wasn't a historic night. If you go back through US history, it's quite expected that the president's party always suffers badly in the first midterm election. So it is with reason that Donald Trump is talking about having a good night. But let's be honest about this. It's going to be 2 years worth of hell for Donald Trump moving forward now, because the Democratic Party controls the House of Representatives, which means they can begin all the investigations that they've wanted to. They now have subpoena power, they have the chairmanship, and they have the ability to make life very, very difficult for Donald Trump at an investigative point and preventing any legislation getting through that they don't want.
Professor Clodagh Harrington, let's get right to the prospect of those investigations, possibly reopening an investigation into Donald Trump's tax affairs. But let's talk about the I word. I think it was 60 Democrats who said, if they took control of the House of Representatives, they would be pushing for Donald Trump to be impeached. Obviously, there are lots of things to go through before we could get to that point. But do you think something like that's going to happen?
I'm really not sure, Anita, that would actually play out. I mean, it's been the liberal fantasy for quite some time now, and yet, if you think from January onwards, as James Boyce has just said, it's going to be quite a challenge for Donald Trump to continue with the wind behind him in the way that he has for the past 2 years. But, for example, I did an event last night. We had a former congressional Democrat on the panel, and he said the American people are not keen to go through the impeachment process again. They remember the last time round quite clearly. Obviously, it was, with Bill Clinton on the other side of things, but just the sort of the trauma and the real reinforcement of divisions that brings. So I would say certainly the fact that the Democrats will have subpoena power from January is meaningful, and they can go after all sorts of things like those pesky tax returns that everyone's been waiting on for a long time, and even the more serious stuff about the ties to Russia. But actual impeachment, I'd say not yet.
James, a lot of people have been looking at this election with huge interest, not just in the US, but around the world. And the reason it's been so significant, of course, is because of the position that Donald Trump has taken internationally, pulling out of treaties and deals and so on and so forth. So do you think we are going to see a very, very different next 2 years of the Donald Trump presidency as a result of these results?
Well, we need to keep last night's results in context, because Donald Trump remains president for 2 years. He still has a Senate on his side, in fact, an increased majority in the United States Senate. The House of Representatives, as you're rightly asking Clodagh about, could potentially impeach Donald Trump, but that would certainly not lead to his removal from office, simply because of the strong Republican majority in the Senate at this point. In terms of last night's impact upon the world stage, I think it's perhaps easy to overstate that, because the American president maintains great powers on the foreign affairs side of things. It's always the case as well that during an American presidency, they usually begin looking at domestic affairs and become increasingly focused on foreign affairs, simply because of the ability of the Congress, in particular the House of Representatives, to stymie their domestic agendas. So it wouldn't surprise me if Donald Trump started to become more of a statesman, but only because, quite frankly, that is the natural trajectory of most presidents at this time.
OK. Former President Obama, Clodagh, had said that the character of the country was on the ballot in these elections. So looking at the results that we have, with a few still to come in, what does it say to you about the character of American politics, American democracy right now?
I would say that right at this moment, it's demonstrating multiple personalities. Some of those House wins were, and governorship victories as well. They were a really clear message for that a lot of people want a progressive agenda. The New York outcome, Michigan, Minnesota, with first youngest woman elected to Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a self-described socialist, is the word that she uses. The first two Muslim women appointed to Congress. These are, symbolic steps forward, and substantive steps as well. So you're going to have that, and then the kind of the doubling down of the Trump rhetoric and efforts to still, plow on with his agenda. I don't imagine he's going to wake up after all this and say, maybe it's time to start reaching across the aisle. I mean, who knows? He's an unpredictable guy, but I would be surprised. So I think this kind of polarization and two characters or two personalities of the country is just going to become more pronounced.
Picking up on those first that Clodagh was talking about, James, do you think this is characterising a changing demographic in the US, or is it about different voters being energised by what's been going on in the last couple of years?
There's an awful lot of talk about demographic shifts in the United States, and there was a lot of talk also last night about looking at sort of suburban areas of the country. But I think that, one of the things that most people remember Barack Obama saying was the idea that there's no red states, blue states, there's only the United States. Well, that was great rhetoric, but unfortunately it's simply not true. If you look at most of the states, they are predominantly holding true to their patterns. Even last night in Texas, where there were great hopes amongst the Democratic Party that they might be able to oust Ted Cruz, Texas returned to its standard format and re-elected him.
And Beto O'Rourke spent $70 million versus Cruz's $30 million, didn't he?
People, let's be honest about it, we were already talking about him as a potential presidential candidate, even though he hadn't actually won the seat at that point. Also, the leading Democrat in Florida lost the campaign for the governorship. So the progressive era and the progressive movement of the Democratic Party, I think, will be disappointed. But so too moderates. There was a fantastic candidate, Amy McGrath, running, for example, in Kentucky's 6th, who the Democratic Party had an awful lot of hope in. She was a former U.S. service personnel. She had a fantastic resume and would have been an interesting candidate moving forward. She unfortunately lost as well. So a real mixed bag, I think, for the leading candidates that the Democratic Party have put great stake in by last night.
If we've got time for a couple more questions, Clodagh, what do you think this means for domestic politics in the US over the next couple of years? Are we going to see more, government shutdowns, lots of deadlocks, lots of frustration?
I think government shutdowns could be the sort of the practical manifestation of a lot of this, because you're literally going to have a sort of, a clashing of horns over so many issues. And now that Nancy Pelosi is going to be back, in her former position, she said last night at some point, she said, Democrats now own the ground, so there is going to be possible continuous stalemate, as James said. Maybe this is now the moment for Trump to start looking out internationally and going, okay, I need to be a statesman because I can't really get a whole lot at home. I mean, often that doesn't tend to happen till the second term, but he might find himself in that position now. But I mean, one would hope that there are some things that they can, find common ground on. There are some things that people are in agreement on.
Clodagh, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to cut you off there mid-answer as we're running out of time. But Clodagh Harrington and James D. Boyce, thank you very much. You're watching BBC News. Stay with us for more coverage of the US midterm elections.
Hello again. This morning it has been a pretty wet start to the day across many parts of the UK, and we're going to continue with that. We've got some rain and we've also got some showers following on in Hot Hills. It's also going to be windy with a little bit of sunshine in between, but you can see all the rain we've had moving in from the west, pushing northwards and eastwards. A lot of surface water and spray on the roads, and also the odd rumble of thunder as well, courtesy of this clutch of weather fronts moving across the country. Now, if you look at the spacing off the isobars, it is going to be pretty windy, especially with exposure on the coasts and also the hills. So it's been a murky start. Some of us now starting to see some brightness as rain has pushed away from the southeast, but a lot of showers coming into the west. Some of those will merge to give longer spells of rain, and some of them will still be heavy and possibly thundery. Into the afternoon, these are our maximum temperatures in Scotland. A little bit of brightness around the Moray Firth, but some heavy showers coming in across the southwest. Heavy showers coming in across Northern Ireland, northwest England, and an array of showers as we come across Wales and into southern counties. Not all of us will see them, of course, because there are showers, but if you do catch one, it could be quite pokey. Temperatures today ranging from about 11 to 14. Yesterday's top temperature was 17 in Manston in Kent, so we're not expecting to see those dizzy heights today. Now, through this evening and overnight, you can see how our showery rain moves away, connected to this area of low pressure, taking the rain northwards out of Scotland. Then we're looking at clear skies. The temperature will tumble. It's going to be a cold night, especially in rural areas where some of us will see a touch of frost. And at the same time, our next system starts to come in, bringing some showery outbreaks of rain to the west. Now, tomorrow we start off with a lot of dry weather and sunshine, but this system, as it pushes north across Scotland, tends to fizzle, but it will pep up across southwest England, Wales, northwest England, and also the east of Northern Ireland, with some persistent rain and windy conditions. Temperatures, well, we're looking at about 8 to about 14, but we will see some sunshine on either side of that. Now, as we move on into Friday, we still will have a band of cloud and showery rain moving northwards. Then we see a gap where there'll be a lot of dry weather, but then we've got the next area of low pressure coming in, bringing heavy and persistent rain accompanied by windy conditions. The strongest winds will be in southern England, southwest England and Wales. With exposure, we could have gusts up to 70 miles an hour.
2018 marks the centenary of the end of World War I. Concluding a week of special programs, we remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice and ask how people will mark the anniversary now and in the future. Armistice Centenary, this weekend on the BBC News Channel.
Stories set to shape the news agenda. Headlines freshly written. Original perspectives on the day's unfolding narratives. See the bigger picture as it emerges. The Papers, weeknights at 10:40 on the BBC News Channel.
Please come in. For the first time in a generation, BBC Two spent 12 extraordinary months. This is all for Britain. With the people looking out for Britain in these unpredictable times. Inside the Foreign Office starts Thursday the 15th of November on BBC Two and BBC iPlayer.
Hello and welcome back to our special results programme on the US midterm elections. Well, let's get more on those elections now. And in a blow to President Donald Trump and his Republican Party, the Democratic Party has taken control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 8 years. This is the current makeup of the House of Representatives. That's the lower chamber of Congress, where all 435 seats were up for re-election. And you can see the Democrats in blue have won 219 seats. That's more than they needed to have an overall majority. So as things stand, the Democrats up 27 seats, the Republicans down 27. But it's a different story in the Senate, the upper house of Congress, where almost a third of the seats were contested. And as you can see here, the Republicans have kept control of this house by picking up enough seats to give them a majority. The figures on the screen for you there. Well, one of the most watched Senate races of these elections was the battle for Texas, traditionally very much a Republican state. And it was the Republican Ted Cruz, once a candidate, you'll remember, for the Republican nomination to be president last time round. But he won, seeing off Democratic challenger Beto O'Rourke. This was one of the most heavily publicised and most watched races of these midterms. O'Rourke for the Democrats spent $70 million versus $30 million spent by Cruz. O'Rourke dominated among voters aged 30 or under, a bit of a rock star for the Democrats, with suggestions that the traditionally deeply Republican state perhaps could turn Democrat in the future. He certainly made significant inroads, 48% to 51% for Ted Cruz. Well, Cruz was emotional as he thanked supporters, his family and his Democratic challenger. Let's have a listen.
And I want to also take a moment to congratulate Beto O'Rourke. He poured his heart into this campaign. He worked tirelessly. Listen, it's important. He worked tirelessly. He's a dad, and he took times away from his kids. And I want to also say, millions across this state were inspired by his campaign. They didn't prevail, and I am grateful the people of Texas chose a different path. But let me say to all of those who worked on his campaign, all of those who were inspired, that I am your senator as well. My responsibility is to represent every Texan.
Ted Cruz. Well, Pennsylvania, which was won narrowly by President Trump in 2016, has taken centre stage in these 2018 midterm elections. Mr. Trump campaigned in the state several times over the autumn, hoping to motivate his base to turn out for Republican candidates. But it was Democrat Bob Casey who narrowly took the Senate seat. And a short time ago, the BBC's Nick Bryant. Let me just, before we go to Nick Bryant, let's just have a look at the share of the vote there. A pretty clear margin for the Democrats in Pennsylvania. That's interesting, actually, because in some states where Donald Trump campaigned, the Republicans did very well. But this is one where he campaigned heavily, but the Democrats won the day. Well, the BBC's Nick Bryant is in the state's largest city, Philadelphia, and he explained what we can take away from the Rust Belt results and what it might mean for the presidential elections in 2020.
The Republicans gained in Pittsburgh. The Republicans look like they've gained in that congressional district number 1, which we were talking about earlier, Bucks County. So these results are very uneven. So I think a lot of people are projecting onto these results a lot of different meanings. I mean, what is significant tonight is how many moderate Democrats have done well. People like Mikey Sherrill, she's a Democrat in New Jersey, a former Navy helicopter pilot. Now, the lesson from that may be the Democrats need to field a moderate candidate in the presidential election. But a lot of the millennials in this bar tonight were cheering those on the left of the party. So it's difficult. I think the Democrats will be worried about Florida as well. I mean, that looks like, you know, it's becoming more of a Republican state at the moment, and that makes life difficult when you're trying to assemble an electoral college victory. You don't need Florida to win the presidency, but it certainly helps.
Nick Bryant in Philadelphia. Well, let's go to Washington now and let's get more from our correspondent Chris Buckler there. Chris, how far away are we now actually from all of the results being declared? Because there are still a few more to come in, aren't there?
Yeah, some of them may be very tight, and that's particularly true for a couple of the gubernatorial races. Those are the races for governors. So it might take a while yet. But as far as the Congress is concerned, as far as Senate and the House of Representatives is concerned, I think we've got a pretty full picture now of what is happening here. And that is that the Democrats are essentially now in charge in the lower chamber, and Republicans have cemented their majority in the upper chamber. And as a result, there are going to be lots of people just looking at these results and trying to draw some sense of what they actually mean. As Nick was mentioning there, there's a really interesting one in Florida. If you take a look at the race for governor there, the man who won was Ron DeSantis, who is somebody who very much presented himself as somebody supported by President Trump, but who wanted to be like President Trump. In one of his adverts, for example, he even built a wall with his children. He dressed them up in Donald Trump gear, and he actually read from The Art of the Deal, Donald Trump's book, to them as part of the promotional advert for his run at becoming governor. And some will be looking at that and saying, does that mean that President Trump has been successful in not just leading people to victory as far as the Senate is concerned, but also in terms of just giving them a sense that he potentially is someone who can take it forward? And I think the parties are going to be looking at this very closely to see whether or not Donald Trump and his type of republicanism is something that they will have to look at 2020 going forward. As for the Democrats, they will say that they've had big success in the House of Representatives, but privately I think they are going to be disappointed with the results in Senate. Not holding all of those seats is something that will worry them.
OK, Chris, thank you very much. Chris Buckler in Washington. Well, in Nevada, the Democratic Party candidate Jackie Rosen defeated the incumbent Republican Senator Dean Heller. Speaking in Las Vegas after the result, Jackie Rosen said women were taking their country back.
After all the hate that I've seen recently, that we've all seen, I can't tell you how much this means to me as a former synagogue president to stand here tonight as your next senator. Hate will never win. Hate will never win. And plenty of people had their doubts that this victory would be ours tonight. But this is the story of this election cycle. Women stepping up to lead, to take back our country and take back the agenda in Washington.
Jackie Rosen saying that women are stepping up to lead. And indeed, 2018 was billed as the year of the woman ahead of the midterms, and it turned out to be true. More women than ever before stood as candidates, and there are now a record number of female members of Congress. Caroline Rigby has been speaking to some of the candidates who hope to win seats.
This year's pool of candidates was a diverse one. Women running in record numbers, a so-called pink wave indicating a wider sea change in American politics. More Native American, Muslim, Latino, immigrant and LGBT candidates on the ballot too. Female voters, particularly college-educated and suburban white women, also a huge part of this election.
Even in the last week, Donald Trump's rhetoric around immigration, particularly after the shooting in Pittsburgh and other violence we've seen, I think that was truly repellent to a lot of college-educated women and women in general.
While support for Donald Trump remains strong amongst his core voters, undoubtedly some women have been put off by a president who many perceive as misogynistic. Divided too over the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court after multiple accusations of sexual misconduct.
I've been saying since the beginning of this campaign that change is coming to America, and change is coming to Virginia 10. And that change came tonight.
The first House seat to flip for the Democrats came early in the night for Jennifer Wexton in Virginia, ousting Republican Representative Barbara Comstock. The Republicans may have fielded fewer female candidates, but the party remained confident that voters would be swayed by policies as much as people.
When the rubber meets the road, we have to choose, between two candidates in any given race. And for most voters, it's more about the ideology and the party of the candidate than the gender.
And whether down to gender or not, staunch conservative Marsha Blackburn became the first female to represent Tennessee in the Senate. Considered a safe Republican seat, her opponent failed to win despite high-profile backing from pop star Taylor Swift. Elsewhere, the first two Muslim congresswomen were voted in, both Democrats, one a Somali American who came to the US as a refugee at the age of 12. These firsts, just some among so many in this year's midterms, evidence of a changing landscape in America, perhaps reflecting a new political era too. Caroline Rigby, BBC News.
Well, let's discuss these midterms more. With me here in the studio is the Republican commentator Stacey Hilliard-Cork, and we can also speak to Professor Scott Lucas, who's Professor of American Studies at the University of Birmingham. A very warm welcome to both of you, and thanks for joining us on this BBC News special. Stacey, first of all, let's talk about those firsts and the number of women who are now in American politics on both sides in positions of leadership in the Senate and in the House and so on. It's very encouraging, isn't it?
It is encouraging, and I think it's something over 100 women now will be in Congress, so it's much more reflective of the general population. And the problem's always been getting women to run, not necessarily getting them to win, but actually getting them to run. And so even those that we saw that didn't win, we saw a wave of women running for congressional seats and for Senate seats. And if you look at Arizona, it's going to be a female senator no matter what, no matter who wins that seat.
Let's talk more broadly about the overall results before we get into some of the detail. Scott Lucas, it was billed potentially as a blue wave, perhaps not quite a blue wave?
Oh, no, it's a wave. You just don't necessarily see a wave while it's still rising. The reason why we're not seeing it is because the safety net for the Republicans is they were able to get a small gain in the Senate because they were defending so few seats, and the Democrats had to defend so many. And because the Republicans, let's say this, were still able to pull out the older white vote, especially the rural vote. But let's look about the wave. One, Democrats outpolled Republicans by 9% across all Senate and representative races last night. Amongst women, it was a 19% advantage for Democrats, and amongst 18 to 24-year-olds who came out in larger numbers yesterday, the advantage for the Democrats was 35%. If that holds, and if the key issue, as it was yesterday for Americans, is health care, then in 2020, when the Republicans have to defend the Senate and Donald Trump has to defend the White House, they're going to have a much tougher ride, and then we could be talking about a real wave.
Scott, thanks for concentrating through. It sounds like you've got some building work going on in the background, but Stacey, what do you make of what Scott Lucas has to say there? Do you think that this is actually a blue wave of Democrats that we're seeing? It hasn't ebbed to the point where it's actually cutting into the Republican lead in the Senate. But do you think that is inevitable?
I don't think it's a wave. I would disagree with Scott on that. This is traditionally what happens. There's only been 3 times since the Civil War where the president's party has actually won the House and kept the House in the midterm election. So this isn't any surprise. And the Democrats' majority that they're going to be gaining in the House is not that big. So they still have a very small majority that they're going to be working with versus what the Republicans had coming in. coming into the 2020 election, the Democrats have a real challenge ahead of them because they don't have anybody who's perceived as a real leader or potential candidate that can actually attract those people in the rural areas in the U.S. and those people within the middle. And if you look at the Senate race in Texas where Beto O'Rourke lost and everybody thought that he had a really good chance of defeating Ted Cruz, Beto really misunderstood his populace, the people he was talking to. He didn't understand that there is a traditionally conservative state and that he needed to actually attract them, but he was too progressive in his agenda.
Stacey has a point, doesn't she, Scott, coming up to 2020, because, of course, inevitably everybody looks at these results and thinks about the next presidential election. Is there an obvious Democratic contender for the presidency, someone who can take on the force of personality that is Donald Trump?
That's a fine Republican spin from Stacey. It's not actually what happened. And it's interesting that she praises women in politics and misses, for example, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, Senator Kamala Harris of California, all of whom are potential presidential candidates in 2020, and there are more beyond that. And it's interesting that she would miss the trend amongst women voters, and even, let's talk about Texas, a deep red Republican state in which the senator is a former presidential candidate, and yet he narrowly avoided an upset. Why? Because instead of reacting to the Republican calls, which were anti-immigrant, you saw many people, women, young people, and Hispanic Americans come out and actually reject that type of language. If that continues until 2020, if Donald Trump is still aggressive, if he's still there despite the Russia investigation, that's not the hill that I think you want to die on if you're a Republican.
Listening to both of you, I think possibly you can agree on the fact that over the next 2 years, politics is going to become very polarized and really tightly fought. Stacey?
It's going to continue to be polarized. And if the Democrats continue to want to have that polarization, if they want to investigate instead of legislate, then they're going to have an even tougher time in 2020. Because if they continue to go down and try to fight dirty with Donald Trump, that's where he shines and that's where he does well, whether people like it or not. That they're going to misjudge that and they're actually going to do themselves a disservice.
Scott, what do you think the best course of action would be for the Democrats? Is it to dig into Donald Trump's background, alleged election interference, his tax affairs, whatever, or is it to take the higher ground and focus on policies and appealing to the voter?
I don't want to close by talking about Democrat versus Republican, and I don't want to follow Stacey with this idea of polarized, aggressive politics. I'm tired of it.
It is polarized, though, isn't it? Would you not say?
No, it's not. No, because I think all Americans agree on the fact that they want a decent healthcare system. I think all Americans want a decent respect, whether you're LGBT, whether you're a woman, whether you're a person of color, or whether you're an immigrant. I think Americans want to stop shouting at each other, and they want a discussion which isn't one in which there's actually at the point of saying all media is fake and saying that all opponents are low IQ and crazy. No, that's not the way it has to be. And if we stop making it polarized with our comments, listen to people. They want a better way forward. And beyond Donald Trump, that way is there.
OK, well, Professor Scott Lucas and Stacey Hilliard-Cork, thank you both very much for sharing your views with us today. Well, let's cross now to New York, where we can speak to Laura Podesta, CBS News correspondent, as well as the Congress election. Americans in 36 states have been voting for governors. The New York governor is always a really high-profile role, isn't it, Laura? Tell us what's been happening there.
Well, flip seats were also apparent in governor's races. We know that in Illinois, Michigan, and New Mexico, those are among that we know for sure now that have turned blue. But the outcome of many contests like the gubernatorial race in Georgia are still up in the air, Anita. But it does look right now like Democrats are leading when it comes back to winning back the executive branch in several states.
And if you can tell us a little bit more about New York then specifically, that would be fantastic, Laura.
Well, Andrew Cuomo staying as Democratic governor of New York State. I do want to talk, though, about the other states that have flipped. In Illinois, we know that businessman J.B. Pritzker, he ousted first-term Republican Governor Bruce Rauner, so that was a big change. He really wants to get rid of the damage that he said that Governor Bruce Rauner had done in that first term. Democrat Gretchen Whitmer won in Michigan by defeating the Republican there. In Wisconsin, we also had Governor Scott Walker, who was a one-time presidential candidate, as you know. He was denied a third term as governor, though he won't concede yet to Democrat Tony Evers.
And you mentioned, I think, the campaign for Georgia governor, that not declared yet. That's an interesting race, isn't it? Stacey Abrams seeking to become America's first African-American female governor.
Yeah, exactly. So this would be a historic election if she does, in fact, get elected as governor. But right now it looks like it's going to be a runoff situation on December 4th. So she has not yet conceded, even though she's coming in at just slightly less in the percentage against her opponent. So she says that Georgia still has a decision to make, a decision between division and trickery. So that was a bitterly fought campaign, and we will find out on December 4th if she will become the first ever female African-American governor, or if Brian Kemp will win that seat in Georgia.
Okay, Laura, thank you very much. Laura Podesta there in New York for us. Well, President Trump has called the results a tremendous success, but how have others in the White House been reacting? The White House press secretary, Sarah Sanders, spoke to reporters earlier and acknowledged the loss of the House, but said retaining control of the Senate made it a big victory for the president.
We feel good. It's been a good night for the president up until this point. The Senate race in Indiana, a huge moment for the president. Somebody he did an event for just yesterday. Obviously, candidates that have embraced the president, embraced his policies, and that he's gone in and campaigned for and worked hard for. We're seeing that pay off tonight. Marsha Blackburn, Andy Barr, Mike Braun in Indiana. So certainly a good place, but still a very long night to go. The president is going to continue doing exactly what he came to Washington to do, and he can do that whether Democrats have control of the House or not. The question is whether Democrats actually want to come to Washington and do the job that they were elected to do and actually solve real problems.
Well, 2018, as we've been discussing, has been described as the year of the woman in these midterm elections. And one of the most interesting races, we mentioned it just a few moments ago, was that for the governor of Georgia, the Democrat candidate Stacey Abrams, seeking to become the first African-American woman to run a state when she ran for Georgia governor. Now, she's had support from big names like Oprah Winfrey. And here's what she had to say when she addressed supporters a little earlier.
Hard work is in our bones. And we have proven this every single day, Georgia. With doors knocked, with calls made, with miles traveled, with prayers prayed to the highest heavens. And tonight we have closed the gap between yesterday and tomorrow. But we still have a few more miles to go. But hear me clearly, that too is an opportunity to show the world who we are. Because in Georgia, civil rights has always been an act of will and a battle for our souls. And because we have been fighting this fight since our beginnings, we have learned a fundamental truth. Democracy only works when we work for it.
Stacey Abrams, and as Laura Podesta from CBS News was saying just a few seconds ago, that race really, really tight against her Republican rival. And in fact, it may go to a runoff next month. So we're keeping a very close watch on that race for the governor in Georgia. So an election of firsts, and as you now know, the new House of Representatives will be the most diverse ever, with more women and minority lawmakers than ever before. Let's take a look at some of the key seats around this. The 29-year-old Democrat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you can see her here, has become the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. She won in New York City's 14th district, and there are the results. And we've seen some tight races in these midterms, but that was an absolutely stonking victory for her. And here she was a few hours ago addressing her supporters at her victory party.
What we are standing up for is what is right. That's right. And we will never be ashamed for fighting for what is right.
Well, let's discuss these midterm elections. Very interesting. Dr. James D. Boys is still with us, Professor of International Political Studies at Richmond, the American University in London. I touched on this with one of the guests a few minutes ago, James, because inevitably with these elections, we look towards 2020 and the next presidential election. What sort of platform do these results give both the Republican Party and possibly Donald Trump again, and the Democratic Party with an as yet undecided candidate for that next presidential election?
It's almost hilarious, isn't it? The votes haven't been counted. We haven't had the results confirmed, and we're already talking about 2 years from now.
We're jumping ahead of ourselves slightly, but inevitable.
What we're going to find, I think, is that both sides will take what they want to see from last night. Donald Trump and the Republican Party will rightly say, hang about, we extended our control of the United States Senate, we still have the presidency, etc., etc. The blue wave was not as impressive as many people feared from the Republican side of things. Whilst on the Democratic side of things, I'll say, well, hang about a second, we saw a 7.2 swing to our side of things. We've now got the House of Representatives back. We can begin our investigations. We can change the political dynamic moving forward. So I think what you're going to see is merely the continuation of where we are at the moment. Donald Trump will keep being Donald Trump. And the Democratic Party will still, I think, not know quite how to handle him. I think it was Stacey saying earlier on, if the American Democrats try to get down in the dirt with Donald Trump, that's very happy for Donald Trump. He's very happy being there. How do they try to take a nuanced political message to the American people when Donald Trump is being so adroit at basically making this about relatively black and white checkbook issues? Maybe the Democrats leave that to the Mueller investigation. It's possible, and that certainly is going to start moving into high gear. That's been relatively closed down recently. OK, James, thank you very much. A briefer chat this time, but appreciate your thoughts on the midterms. And right now, before we take a look at the weather forecast, just to sum up the midterm elections for you, the Democrats have taken control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 8 years, but the Republicans have made gain in the Senate. You're watching a BBC News special.